Okay, let's talk about the Lumetri color panel. So, going off of our same little sequence we've got going here, I'm just going to go ahead and switch over to the color workspace. And you'll see that I've got my clip selected here. So I know that if I want to do anything to the controls over here in the Lumetri color panel, I know I'm affecting this clip. Now, if I come up here, we see, I'm going to close these all down so you can see that the 6 sections of the Lumetri color panel are as follows: basic correction, creative, curves, color wheels and match, HSL secondary, and vignette. And that's it. And there's a lot of powerful features packed in these 6 different sections. Let's start with basic correction. Okay, if I twirl this down, you'll see that I've got, the standard controls that you normally would see when you're going to manipulate the color of something. Exposure, contrast, highlights, all of these things are the general controls. So you'll notice over here too that I've got the scope that comes as part of the color workspace. I've got the Lumetri scope. So this is just one scope, and it's currently set to the RGB waveform, which is the standard view for the Lumetri scope. You'll notice that this is sort of weird and squiggly to look at, but it is actually a visual representation of our shot. See, look at this middle part here where the water is coming up and it's all white. It's very bright. That's actually, you can see that right here. That's that shape. And as I scrub through the timeline, you can see it moving. These reflections off the water here, you can see them throughout the middle. And then, of course, in the center, you'll see the ring of stone around the water, which is showing up here in the middle. And since it is not one solid color of red, green, or blue, it's a combination, you'll see there's overlapping streaks of green, red, and blue. So we have red, green, and blue, RGB, as the 3 primary colors of light. That is the way that we store color information on the computer, and it also happens to be the way that we perceive light with our eyes, because we have 3 different types of cone cells in our retina. There are also rods, but those mainly have to do with contrast, and they help with like night vision, whereas our cones can detect color and are used for color vision for daytime vision. So taking a look at this clip, and I've got it selected here, we don't actually haven't made any changes yet. So if I click over to the effects controls, I see it's just the standard fixed effects. So if I want to actually change something about the color, I need to change a value here. And as soon as I do, boom, it has instantly added the Lumetri color plugin to the effect controls panel. So let's switch back over here to the scope so we can see what's happening. Okay, so what did I do? I really changed the exposure. I bumped that exposure up, and you can see everything just sort of went up toward the top, because this up here is 255, which is the brightest. So that's white, and all the way down here at 0, that is black. The 2 ends of our visual spectrum. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this back to 0. And we can see that using the basic controls, we can affect a lot of different things. If I change the temperature, we can see the way that affects the warmth or the coolness of the shot. Also, look there on the left, the way that the red, green, and blue waveforms are diverging and converging when I change the color temperature. This will give you a good insight into the way that color works in Premiere and the way that our eyes perceive the combined light. So using the Lumetri plugin, we can do the job of color correction, and that is where we try to get the consecutive shots to match so that they have the similar color temperature, a similar brightness, a similar black level, and all of those things. So I'm just actually going to reset this Lumetri color thing. And let's take a look. We've got our fountain, this couple, these two people, and this group. And these two look pretty similar, I would say. And even this one is pretty close. But I do notice that this one seems a little cooler, I think. So let me select this one. I'm going to go to my temperature setting here. And I'm going to just bring it toward the warmer side, just to warm it up a little bit, or a lot bit. And we see that now it looks much warmer. It looks later in the day. You may notice that the morning light tend to be more blue, and the sunset obviously is when things get all orangey and warm color looking. I would say that matches a lot better now, so that falls under the definition of color correction. The other term that we use for affecting color on video is color grading. I know a color grade is usually more of an artistic thing as opposed to a technical thing where you're trying to get things to match, whereas that's color correction. Color grading is more of an artistic endeavor where you're choosing to try and affect the mood or the perception of feeling the audience gets from the colors of the picture. So if I wanted to add a color grade, I could add it to this adjustment layer, which we've been sort of hiding. And if I unhide this and go to my effects controls, I'm going to go ahead and take off that tint that we had earlier. And now I'm going to go ahead and look at the next section here after basic correction. And I'm going to look at the creative section. It's very simple, and there's basically a bunch of different looks that you can apply. These presets come with Premiere Pro, and the presets are actually little files called LUTs, or L-U-T. It stands for lookup table. And as I click through these, you can see that it's basically a preset for the different values of exposure, color temperature, and all of these things, contrast, what have you. So if I wanted to apply a look, I have my adjustment layer selected, so this look I'm going to apply would go over the whole timeline. So I'm going to choose something that looks very different from what we've got right now. Let's call this Iron NDR. And there we have it. The look has been applied, and now we can see, since we already did the color correction and matched the shots with the other ones, now they all have a similar hue when I've applied the look to the adjustment layer. Now LUTs are a great way to get a quick look, but you can also go into a lot more depth by going into the following sections. So if we close the creative section, or actually I want to go ahead and undo this creative section here. If I go to the curves section, you'll now see the first section of the curves section is the RGB curves. You may have seen this if you've ever worked in Photoshop or in some other image editing program. But this is basically, again, a representation of 0 being black and 255 being white. And we've got our RGB colors here and the white channel. So it's really RGBW. So if we look at the overall RGB value, or just the white value, we can place points on this line and then manipulate them. Let's say I want a much darker shadows. I'm going to go ahead and pull the shadows down, and you see the way that's affecting the image there. Let me go ahead and pull up the scopes and you can look at that. So if I were to pull this down, you see the way that the light at the bottom seems to all get scrunched up there. That's all getting compressed. And all this stuff up here is sort of getting really stretched out. Now if I undo that, and if I were to bump the top half of the curve, you'll see that now I'm really lifting all these little highlights here, and all this stuff got stretched upward. So what was only about this tall is now about this tall as far as the shadows and the low light goes, and the highlights got stretched out to get closer up to this 255 value. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. The curve section in Lumetri is extensive. In addition to being able to change the individual RGB curves, if I grab the red, for example, I can really go for that early morning look. If I were to grab the blue and take that out, I can really lean into the green tint look of this. Again, I'm going to undo, and you'll see the way that I'm able to affect each individual channel by moving the curve up or down. And by adding more points, I can make the curve more complex. But notice, things start to get a little crazy when you have a ton of points on your curve. Another thing that you can do in the curve section, they've added all these different controls here. We've got hue versus saturation, hue versus hue, hue versus luma, luma versus saturation, and saturation versus saturation. It seems like a lot to get your head around, but let's just take a look at some simple adjustments we can make here. This seems good. Okay, we'll choose to affect the blue tones and see if we can get the sky to change a little bit in color. So if I'm going to go here to the hue versus saturation, if I want the sky to be desaturated, I'm going to place node points on either side of the blue values in the curve, and then I'll place a node in the middle of the blue that I want to affect. Now when I click and I'm still holding the button down, you can see that I've got up at the top more and more saturated blue, and at the bottom it gets closer and closer to just plain grayscale. So if I move it up towards more blue, you can see that the sky increases in saturation, but not really the rest of the shot. Just anything that's blue, like here, the sky up here, maybe a little bit of the building. But this is obviously very exaggerated. Now I'm going to undo this, and if I grab the center again and I pull it down, we can see that the sky and everything else blue, like this little bench and the sky here, have all gone desaturated. The same thing can be done on the other types of curves here. So we can manipulate the actual hue of the blue sky, for example, by placing node points around the value we want to manipulate, and then grab a node point in the middle, and when I'm still holding it down, it demonstrates that you can move up or down to tint the blue towards green or towards magenta. And it's a simple and quite effective tool. And you see, even though I'm drawing this extreme curve, if I come back here and hit play, it plays it back just fine. So since I still have yellow above my timeline, I can tell that the effect is accelerated or does not need acceleration because there's still yellow above the timeline. Okay, now coming back, I can undo this and go down. You get the idea. Basically, we can increase the brightness or luma of the blue if we wanted to. And if I undo that and we go down further, and if we want to affect the luma versus saturation, again, from left to right, we're going from 0 to 255. That's from black all the way to white. So if I want the mid-neutral gray tones or the mid-tones, and I want to really increase the saturation of the mid-tones, I would grab a point in the middle and bump it up. And I don't know if you can see what's happening there on the left side over here, but as the saturation increases, you'll notice the way that these RGB values are redistributed across the waveform. So if we were to pull this all the way down, now we've desaturated most of the mid-tone content, and you can see it all getting washed out here and becoming really just white. So if I undo that, I can show you the saturation versus saturation. So again, 0 to 255, but in this case, it's saturation versus saturation. So 0 represents grayscale or monochrome, and 100 represents fully saturated. So if I grab a point in the middle and just start pulling it up without any other points, then it's just basically acting like a slider, and overall saturation is affected. So I actually want to undo that. And if I want to manipulate just, say, the midtones again, I'm going to define two nodes outside of this section that I'd like to change, and I will grab a midpoint and then can push it up to get more saturation in the middle or less saturation in the middle. Now I can move on to the next section. Let me close up this curves, and we see the next section is called color wheels and match. And this may be familiar to you. You may have seen this 3 color wheel thing before. Maybe you've seen pictures of a professional colorist's edit suite. You might notice special rooms that they have for doing color correction and color grading, in which they have a setup with 3 track balls that manipulate these 3 color wheels directly. One of the great tools that comes with Premiere Pro is the ability to compare 2 shots at once. I'm going to go ahead and click this comparison view here, and you see how we get 2 shots next to each other. Now on the left, this is our comparison shot, and allows us to put the timeline anywhere we want so that we can hold on that frame, and then with our playhead down here on the timeline, we can then choose the shot that we want to compare and match. So say I want to go to this shot again, and remember, when I have this selected, I can reset the entire Lumetri plugin by clicking the reset arrow. Now that I've got the Lumetri back to the default settings, I'd like for it to go ahead and try to match this shot to this shot. So I'm going to go ahead and click Apply Match. And you can see it guessed, and maybe it's not the greatest, but it did warm up quite a bit. And now the shots are in a much closer color space. You can see up here at the top we've got the sky. The sky is looking closer. We don't have the sky here, but we have the brightest part of the image at the top as well. For me, though, I don't think it's as good of a match as what I would like, and the mid-tones are just a little too much red, and the shadows, again, are also a little too red. You can see too much red here in what should be a dark black or a dark brown. So I'm going to grab the shadows. I'm going to click and drag it away from the red just to kind of cool it down a little. And if you see the scopes there on the left, you can see that the red layer over here was going down. Now, the midtones, as you can see, they got really slanted towards the red here, and that's where we see that coming out, especially in the bench here, in the skin tones, and in the clothing. Everything just kind of got a real reddish tint. So I'm going to go ahead and click and drag and bring it a little bit back towards the center. Not all the way, but maybe try and back off like half of that. Now you can see it doesn't look exactly as sepia toned or sort of old-timey looking as it did before. We got a more balanced image, and I think the two really now have a much better visual match. The next section is called HSL secondary, and we can use it to affect one color in the scene at a time. After we've done the initial grade and correction, we can then go to the HSL secondary. We can choose, say, this blue color here, and we want to affect it. We can then turn it more green, let's say. Perhaps we want it to be actually red. Now it's more purple. So it's only affecting that one color since we've narrowly defined it with our eyedropper. Now if we wanted to expand the range of the luma, we can grab this here. We can grab the edge of it and expand it out. We can grab this and actually widen the range. This is the drop off or the roll off at the ends. But as I move this around, you see that is right where I want it to be because I'm getting the whole bench, but I'm not getting a sky yet. If I were to drag it further to the right, you can see how the sky now is starting to get selected as well, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to go back here where I just have that bench in there. Perfect. Now, that's very extreme, and I'm sure it helps to visually demonstrate what we're doing, but we would obviously probably want to back off on that effect. All right, and then the last one is called vignette, and I'm sure that you know what that's about because we can have a nice softening of the edges. It's supposed to simulate the circular shadow that the lens barrel would cast upon the negative or on the camera sensor. And we can adjust settings like the midpoint, or we can bring the midpoint in and out. We can also change the roundness, so whether we want it to look more anamorphic or more circular. And there's also the feather, so how hard or soft the edge is. And I usually like to have it nice and feathered out, and I like the darkened edges too, but I would probably push that midpoint out so that we're not affecting the entire image, just kind of the corners and edges. One interesting thing too is in Premiere Pro, if you actually push this up above 0, you'll get what's called a negative vignette, in which you start to blow out the edges and it gets more closer to white. It gets lighter around the edges, which is not something you would actually have in real life. Next up, let's look at the Lumetri Scopes panel.